Hello everyone, and welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. Now in this video I want to continue our discussion on the electromagnetic spectrum, adding in a few more regions that are going to be important for you to know moving forward in remote sensing. So just to sort of recap what we've already talked about, right, we have this thing called the electromagnetic spectrum, which is really every single possible wavelength that electromagnetic radiation can have. And we sort of already said that's basically an infinite range, right? Wavelengths can be extremely short in the case of gamma rays, all the way up to extremely long in the case of radio waves. And we sort of narrowed down this region between 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers that we call the visible spectrum. That's all the wavelengths that we as humans can see with our eyes, that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in the context of optical remote sensing. And as I mentioned before, it's not just humans that have adapted to this small range of wavelengths. It's a lot of biological processes really do occur within a little bit before to a little bit after this visible spectrum. And so it's really a key range or a key region to analyze and understand. But as I just said, there are some cases outside of this visible spectrum that we're really interested in. And in particular, especially for most remote sensing applications, we tend to go a little bit on the longer side, not shorter. So let's go ahead and just add a couple more regions that you should be familiar with, extending beyond this 700 nanometer range. So the first is going to be, and I'm going to try and do this in, hopefully this shows up okay, in a slightly darker color. So when you go past the reds, right, so actually I didn't change the color here. So from about 700, it doesn't show up very well, does it? From about 700 to 800 nanometers. Actually, let's make that a little bit cleaner. From about 700 to 800 nanometers, right? This range is called the red edge. Now, you might not necessarily see this red edge talked about, depending on the textbook you're reading, because this red edge here really is predominantly focused on dealing with vegetation, because as we look at spectral response curves in later videos, when you look at vegetation, you'll see that by and large, they exhibit this very striking shape in this 700 to 800 nanometer range. And so when you're dealing with remote sensing of vegetation, we actually have a specific region we call the red edge. And so as you go past the red edge, right, past 800 nanometers, you get into another big region in remote sensing. And it goes from 800 nanometers to about 1300 nanometers. Actually, yeah. And we call this near infrared. Near infrared, or you'll oftentimes see it abbreviated as NIR, near infrared, or NIR. So that's another region. This region is particularly important because things tend to have even if they're similar in the visible spectrum, different objects in the real world tend to display very different properties in the near infrared. So near infrared can be an extremely helpful tool in discriminating between objects, which is by and large the point of remote sensing, or at least one of the points of remote sensing, is to be able to discriminate between objects. So even if something looks similar to our eyes, right, say for example trees, right, most tree canopies look green. When you go out into this near infrared range, right, different species tend to behave differently. And so you can really get a lot of discriminative power, right? The ability to discern between different things if you include these sorts of regions in your analysis. And we typically only go about one more step beyond this. And this is from about 1300 to about 3000 nanometers. Actually, I'm going to do this in a different color. Let's change the color up here. Let's do, how about a gray? A light gray, here we go. So from about 1300 to about 3000 nanometers. Right, this is called shortwave. Infrared. Shortwave infrared, also sometimes called SWIR or SWIR. So again, we've added 3 additional regions here. This region from 700 to 800, which is really the transition from red to near infrared. You'll find a lot of things exhibit interesting properties here, so we've given this its own region called red edge. Then when you start to get into the real near infrared, 800 to 1300 nanometers, this is the real near infrared. And then finally, we have the 1300 to about 3000 is shortwave infrared, or SWIR. And really, these are the regions that you're going to be most likely to encounter with 90% of the data in remote sensing, especially the kinds of data that you're going to work with in a typical remote sensing course, is going to be within these regions, from about 400 nanometers to 700 in the visible, and then extending out to about 3000 in the infrared. Hopefully this made sense. Again, I know it's a little bit much, but I would highly recommend that you sort of internalize these regions and these numbers. So that way when you're dealing with data later on, you can quickly sort of convert between these things. And so if you have any questions, I encourage you to pause the video, go back, rewatch the video, and as always, please reach out. Thank you.